My wife cheated with my brother. They wanted to kill me to get the money from my life insurance. My little son told me about everything that happened in my absence. It was horrible. My name is David, I'm a sailor who earns money for my family's happiness. But a week ago, my life was turned upside down. I was heading home after 3 months at sea, counting down the minutes until I'd see Sophie and Charlie. There was always that thrill of returning to them, the way Sophie would throw her arms around me, and Charlie would run up shouting, "Daddy." Sophie, my wife of 8 years, was stunning. Blonde, busty, with those charming eyes that could talk you into just about anything. People used to say she looked like trouble wrapped in a smile, but to me, she was home. Our house, a little cottage by the coast, was just the right place to raise our son. But this time, heading home didn't feel the same. Sophie's messages had been brief lately, and my younger brother Tom had been spending a lot of time at our place. Tom's 25, athletic, with that easy charm that people gravitate toward. He worked from home as a programmer, so he had the freedom to help Sophie out when I was away. I appreciated it, or at least I thought I did. When I arrived, everything seemed normal. Sophie hugged me tight, her body pressed close like always. Charlie jumped into my arms, laughing. For a moment, I let my worries go. That evening, Tom came by for beers. We sat outside, catching up. He seemed relaxed, but something about the conversation stuck with me. "You know," he said, looking out at the sea, "life's fragile. Anything can happen out there." "Part of the job," I shrugged. "Good thing you've got that life insurance." "What is it?" 2 million. 3. 4 million, I corrected. "Sophie and Charlie will be fine if anything happens to me." Tom gave a slow nod. "Smart move." I didn't think much of it at the time, but as I lay in bed that night, his words echoed in my head. Why bring that up? Something wasn't sitting right with me. But I couldn't see it clearly yet. One thing was certain, though, that $4 million policy. It had just become the most important topic of conversation in my house. The next few days at home felt strange. Sophie was cheerful on the surface, but I noticed little changes. She was glued to her phone, lowering her voice whenever I walked into the room, and she seemed more distracted than usual. Charlie talked about Tom a lot. "Uncle Tom took me to the beach," he said at dinner one evening, grinning. "We played pirates. He let me be the captain." I glanced at Sophie. "Tom's been around a lot, huh?" She shrugged. "He's been helping out while you're gone. It's been nice to have someone around." I nodded, but something about the way she said it stuck with me. The next morning, Sophie was bustling around the kitchen, making breakfast while humming to herself. As I poured my coffee, she slid a plate of eggs and toast in front of me, her eyes sparkling. "Hey, do you ever worry about being out at sea for so long?" she asked casually, sitting down across from me. "Worry?" I raised an eyebrow. "Not really. It's part of the job." She played with her fork, glancing up at me. "But, anything could happen out there, right? Storms, accidents." I sipped my coffee, watching her carefully. "What's this about?" "Oh, nothing." She gave a little laugh. "I was just thinking about how much you do for us. And, you know, what we'd do if something ever happened to you." That made me pause. It wasn't unusual for Sophie to worry, but this felt different. "We'd be fine," I said slowly. "That's what the life insurance is for." Her eyes flickered with interest. "Right. You mentioned that before. It's a lot, isn't it?" "Yeah," I said, feeling uneasy. 4 million. Wow. Sophie's voice was soft, almost impressed. "That's more than I thought." She quickly changed the subject, but the conversation stuck with me. Sophie had never asked about money like that before. It wasn't her style. That afternoon, I took Charlie for a walk by the shore. He talked endlessly about his adventures with Uncle Tom. "Uncle Tom comes over a lot," Charlie said, picking up a shell. "He makes Mommy laugh. They stay up late talking." I frowned. "What do they talk about?" Charlie shrugged. "Grown-up stuff." I forced a smile, but my mind was racing. When we got home, Sophie said she had errands to run. I used the time to park down the street and watch the house from my car. Sure enough, a little after lunch, Tom's car pulled up. He used his spare key to let himself in. I sat there for hours, watching the windows. Around 6 p.m., Sophie appeared in the living room. Tom was behind her, his hands on her shoulders. He whispered something, and she tilted her head back, laughing. It hit me hard, but I still wasn't ready to believe the worst. Maybe it wasn't what it looked like. Maybe I was overthinking it. That night, I brought up the life insurance again, carefully. "Sophie, you were asking about the insurance earlier." "Why?" She hesitated, then smiled. "Oh, just curiosity. It's a lot of money." I didn't realize. Her answer seemed innocent enough, but her tone lingered in my mind. Something wasn't adding up. Not yet. But I was getting closer to figuring it out. The day after Tom's visit, I decided to take Charlie for another walk. I needed to clear my head. The tension in the house was suffocating. Sophie was being overly sweet, checking on me constantly, making my favorite meals, but it all felt off. On the way back, we passed by Mr. Hargrove's house. He was our neighbor, a retired fisherman, mid-70s, always sitting on his porch with a scowl. We'd never had a warm relationship. He wasn't exactly friendly, and I never had much time for small talk. But this time, as we walked past, he called out, "David. Got a minute?" I stopped, surprised. "Sure. Leave the boy to play in the yard," he said, nodding toward his front gate. "We need to talk." Curious, I told Charlie to stay where I could see him, then walked up the path. Mr. Hargrove leaned on his cane, eyes sharp. "Been meaning to have a word with you. Thought you should know what's been going on around here while you've been away." A cold knot formed in my chest. "What do you mean?" He glanced around as if checking for eavesdroppers. "Your brother, Tom. He's been over a lot." "I know," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "He's been helping Sophie." Hargrove snorted. "Helping, huh? Funny kind of help, if you ask me." "What are you saying?" He stepped closer, lowering his voice. "Saw them plenty of times, late at night. Your lights would be off, and his car would be parked down the street, hidden like. They'd be out on the porch, whispering. Sometimes he stayed all night." I clenched my teeth. Maybe he was just. Just what? Hargrove interrupted. "Helping her fix the roof at midnight." "Come on, David. I've been around long enough to know what I'm seeing." I stared at him, heat rising to my face. "Why are you telling me this?" He sighed, rubbing his chin. "Because I hate seeing a man made a fool of. And there's more." He pulled a small notebook from his pocket and handed it to me. "Saw something a few nights ago. Wrote it down." I opened the notebook, scanning the messy handwriting. Wednesday night, 11 p.m., Tom parked 2 streets over. Met Sophie by the back gate. Whispering for a long time. Thursday morning, 9 a.m., Sophie left in Tom's car. Back by noon, looking nervous. Friday night, 10 p.m., Sophie handed Tom a letter. He kissed her hand before leaving. My hands shook as I read. "I didn't want to get involved," Hargrove said quietly. "But it ain't right, what they're doing. Thought you should know." I closed the notebook, feeling like the rug had been pulled out from under me. "Thank you." As I turned to leave, Hargrove called after me. "Be careful, David. Whatever they're planning, it ain't good." I nodded, my mind racing. Back home, I sat in the living room, staring at the notebook. The pieces were coming together, but I needed more proof. And I needed to know just how far Sophie and Tom were willing to go. When I got home, Sophie was in the kitchen, humming to herself as she made dinner. She glanced up and smiled when she saw me, but I couldn't return it. My mind was stuck on Mr. Hargrove's words and the notebook now hidden in my jacket pocket. I sat down at the table, trying to act normal. "You okay?" she asked, stirring the pot on the stove. "Yeah," I muttered. "Tired." Her eyes lingered on me for a second before she turned back to the stove. "I made your favorite stew." She was laying it on thick. Too thick. Later that night, after Sophie went to bed, I pulled out the notebook and went over the notes again. The times, the dates, it all lined up. Tom was coming by when I wasn't home, staying late into the night, and even taking Sophie out in his car. I wasn't ready to confront her. Not yet. I needed more. The next morning, as we sat down for breakfast, Sophie brought up my next trip again. "When are you heading out again?" she asked casually, pouring coffee. "Couple of weeks," I said, watching her closely. "Why?" She shrugged. "Just wondering. It's always an adjustment when you're away." I leaned back in my chair, keeping my tone light. "You'd do fine without me, wouldn't you? You and Tom seem to have things covered." Her hand froze for a split second before she recovered, laughing lightly. "Tom's just helping with Charlie. You know how he adores him." I nodded slowly. "Yeah, he does." The air between us felt heavier after that. Sophie excused herself to take a call outside, and I watched her through the window, pacing as she spoke. I couldn't hear her words, but her expression was tense, nervous. That afternoon, I decided to test something. I walked down the street to Mr. Hargrove's house. He was sitting on his porch, as usual, watching the world go by. "Afternoon, David," he greeted, tipping his hat. I nodded. "Afternoon. Got a question for you." He squinted at me. "Go on. Did you see where they went? When Sophie left with Tom?" Hargrove scratched his chin, thinking. "Saw M head toward town. But one time, they went out the other way. Toward the cliffs." "The cliffs. That's where I used to take Sophie when we first started dating. It was our spot." "Thanks," I said, turning to leave. As I walked back to the house, something in me shifted. The pieces were falling into place, and the picture they painted wasn't good. Sophie wasn't just sneaking around with Tom. They had plans. Plans that didn't include me. Mr. Hargrove's words echoed in my head as I walked back home. The cliffs. It wasn't just any spot. That place had meaning. Sophie and I used to go there when we first fell in love, sitting for hours, watching the waves crash below. It was secluded, peaceful. A place we thought no one knew about. I had to see for myself. That evening, Sophie said she needed to run a few errands. I watched her grab her bag and head out, my heart pounding as I quietly followed. She didn't take the main road toward town, instead, her car turned toward the cliffs. I kept my distance, pulling over just before the gravel path that led to the lookout point. I got out of my car and made my way through the trees on foot. When I reached the edge of the clearing, I saw them. Sophie and Tom were sitting on a blanket near the edge of the cliff, a picnic spread out between them. Sophie's laugh floated through the air, carefree and light. Tom leaned in closer, his hand resting on hers. I froze, my fists clenching. They weren't talking like two people sharing a secret fling. There was more to it. Something calculated. I crouched behind a bush, inching closer to hear them. "I've been looking into it," Tom was saying. "We just need to be smart about it. Sophie nodded. No mistakes. It has to look like an accident. My blood ran cold. Tom's voice dropped lower. Out at sea, no one would question it. People disappear all the time. Sophie bit her lip. And the insurance? Tom nodded. It's solid. 4 million. No delays. My heart pounded in my chest as I realized what they were saying. They weren't just having an affair. They were planning to get rid of me. Are you sure? Sophie asked softly. No second thoughts. Tom reached for her hand, squeezing it. It's the only way we can be together. No one will suspect us. I leaned against the tree, the world spinning around me. I wasn't imagining things. This wasn't paranoia. They were planning my death. And I'd walked right into it without even knowing. As I stood there, a new thought crept into my mind. They thought they were in control. They thought I didn't know. But they were wrong. Very wrong. And I wasn't going to let them win. I crouched behind the trees, phone in hand, taking several photos of Sophie and Tom sitting together at the cliffs. Her head on his shoulder. Their hands intertwined. Tom kissing her forehead. It was all the proof I needed. Their voices carried over the breeze. No mistakes, Sophie said. It'll look like an accident at sea, Tom replied. No one will suspect. I snapped a few more pictures and slipped back to my car, my mind racing. They were planning my death. When I got home, I backed up the photos to a secure cloud account. If anything happened to me, someone would find them. Then, I started making a plan. Talk to a lawyer, quietly. Update my will, cut Sophie out. Set traps, record everything they did and said. When Sophie came home, she smiled sweetly, acting like nothing was wrong. You're back early, she said. Yeah, I replied, forcing a smile. Just needed some air. I kept my tone casual, but inside, I was already preparing for what came next. They thought they were in control. They were wrong. Over the next few days, I started putting my plan in motion. I met with a lawyer discreetly, updated my will to cut Sophie out, and bought a few voice recorders and hidden cameras to plant around the house. But things took a turn I hadn't expected. One evening, as I was checking the footage from the hidden cameras, I caught something strange. Sophie wasn't alone. She was talking to a man, but it wasn't Tom. The man was older, dressed in a suit. He handed Sophie an envelope, and she opened it quickly, her hands shaking. I zoomed in on the screen. Inside the envelope was a thick stack of cash. What about him? Sophie asked. We'll handle it, the man said. But you need to follow the plan. Sophie nodded. No mistakes. I froze, staring at the screen. Who was this man? And why was Sophie taking money from him? The next day, I decided to follow Sophie. I waited until she left the house and quietly trailed her car. She didn't go to the cliffs or meet Tom. Instead, she drove to a small office building on the outskirts of town. I parked a block away and watched as she went inside. 10 minutes later, she came out, with the same man from the video. They didn't notice me as they got into separate cars and drove off in different directions. This wasn't just about Sophie and Tom anymore. There was someone else involved. And suddenly, I realized this wasn't just about love or betrayal. It was bigger. Much bigger. And if I didn't figure it out soon, I wouldn't live to tell the story. The more I watched Sophie, the clearer it became, this wasn't just some love affair gone wrong. There was something deeper, something calculated. She wasn't just sneaking around with Tom, she was working with someone else. And they were closing in. The next evening, Sophie made dinner like everything was normal. She chatted about Charlie, smiled at me like nothing was wrong, but I caught her stealing glances when she thought I wasn't looking. "You've been quiet lately," she said, her voice light. "Just tired," I replied, keeping my tone calm. "Thinking about the next trip." She paused. "How long will you be gone?" 3 months, maybe longer," I said. There it was again, that flicker of something in her eyes. Relief? Excitement? I decided to push things further. "I've been thinking of increasing the insurance," I said casually. "Just to be safe." Her hand froze mid-air. "Really?" "Yeah," I continued, watching her closely. "Charlie's growing up fast. I want to make sure you two are set, no matter what." She forced a smile, but her voice was strained. "That's thoughtful of you." After dinner, I checked the hidden camera footage again. Sophie was on her phone, pacing in the living room. "It's happening soon," she whispered. "We'll stick to the plan." My heart pounded in my chest. Suddenly, Tom's name popped up on the screen. He had texted her, "Are you sure we can trust him?" Sophie replied, "He doesn't know anything. Just keep acting normal." I clenched my jaw. They thought they were playing me. But I was already 2 steps ahead. The next morning, I got a call from my lawyer, Brian. His voice was calm, but the words hit me like a punch. "David, I've been digging into some things. You're not going to like this." "What is it?" "There's a record of a life insurance policy taken out in your name," he said. "But, it wasn't you who signed for it." I gripped the phone tighter. "What are you saying?" "Someone forged your signature, David. And it's a double indemnity policy." My blood ran cold. Double indemnity meant the payout would be doubled if my death was ruled accidental. "I need you to come in," Brian continued. "We need to act fast." I hung up, my mind spinning. Sophie and Tom hadn't just been plotting to kill me. They'd taken out another policy without my knowledge, one that would pay out millions more if I disappeared at sea. This wasn't just about getting rid of me. It was about making sure they profited as much as possible. And now I knew one thing for certain. They wouldn't wait much longer. I spent the rest of that day preparing. Every move Sophie and Tom made now had a new weight to it. They weren't just planning my death, they were counting on it, with a payout so large that it made my stomach churn. I backed up the photos and recordings again, sending copies to my lawyer and a trusted friend. I wasn't taking any chances. If something happened to me, the truth would come out. That evening, Sophie was unusually quiet. She kept glancing at her phone and checking the clock, like she was waiting for something. Then, right after Charlie went to bed, Tom showed up. I stayed out of sight, watching from the hallway as Sophie let him in. They didn't waste time. "We need to move," Tom whispered. "David's trip is coming up fast." Sophie nodded. "Are you sure everything's set?" "Yeah," Tom replied. "The boat will be sabotaged before he leaves. Once he's out at sea, it'll look like a freak accident." My heart pounded in my chest. Sophie's voice dropped to a nervous whisper. "And the other guy? The one handling the insurance?" "He's already been paid," Tom said. "No loose ends." I clenched my fists. They've thought of everything. But they hadn't thought of this. I wasn't going anywhere. Suddenly, Sophie said something that made my blood run cold. "What about Charlie?" Tom frowned. "What do you mean?" "I've been thinking," Sophie said. "If we get the money, what's stopping David's family from asking questions? It might be better if Charlie comes with us, so no one suspects anything." Tom hesitated. "You're talking about taking him?" Sophie nodded. "He's my son. No one will think twice if I move away with him after everything." That was it. I'd been focused on protecting myself, but now I realized the stakes were even higher. They weren't just after me. They wanted to take Charlie too. I quietly stepped back, my mind racing. There was no time left. This wasn't just about justice anymore. It was about survival, for me and for my son. And I knew exactly what I needed to do. The next morning, I sat at the kitchen table, thinking through my next move. I couldn't confront Sophie and Tom yet, I needed to know exactly who else was involved. They weren't working alone. The man I saw meeting Sophie, the forged insurance policy, the mention of someone handling the payout, there were more players in this game. As I sat there, Sophie walked in, her usual bright smile plastered on her face. "I've got a lunch meeting with a friend," she said casually. "Might be out most of the afternoon." I nodded, pretending not to care. "Anyone I know?" "Just Sarah from my yoga class," she said without missing a beat. Sarah. That name triggered something. I remembered Sophie mentioning her once before, a new friend she'd made recently. But I'd never met her, and Sophie rarely made new friends. It was suspicious. Once Sophie left, I made my way to Mr. Hargrove's house. If anyone knew what was happening around here, it was him. "Back again, David," he said, eyeing me from his porch. "Need your help," I said. "Do you know a woman named Sarah? Friends with Sophie?" Hargrove's eyes narrowed. "Sarah Whitmore?" I nodded. "Yeah, I know her," he said, his tone grim. "She's trouble. Used to be married to a real estate guy in town, until he disappeared. She got a big payout from his death. Rumor is she's got a new man handling her affairs." A chill ran down my spine. "Who?" "Name's Rick Pierce," Hargrove said. "Insurance broker. Shady as they come." I thanked him and left, my mind spinning. Rick Pierce. The name stuck with me. It wasn't just Sophie and Tom anymore. There was a whole network of people who made a business out of arranging accidents and collecting insurance payouts. I needed more proof. Later that day, I followed Sophie to a cafe in town. She wasn't meeting Sarah. She was sitting across from a man in a suit, a tall, slim figure with sharp features and cold eyes. Rick Pierce. I took a seat a few tables away, pretending to check my phone while eavesdropping. "We're ready," Sophie was saying. "The trip is in 2 weeks." Rick nodded. "Good. Everything will be taken care of. Just make sure he doesn't get suspicious." "And the money?" Sophie asked. "You'll have it within a week of the payout," Rick said, leaning in. "But remember, no mistakes. If anyone catches wind of this, you're on your own." Sophie nodded, her face serious. "I understand." I clenched my jaw. They were getting ready to strike. But I wasn't going to let them. Rick Pierce and Sarah Whitmore were part of something much bigger. And now, I had new targets to keep my family safe and bring them all down. This wasn't just about Sophie and Tom anymore. This was about uncovering the whole operation. The next morning, I met with Brian, my lawyer. I handed him the notebook from Mr. Hargrove, along with the photos I'd taken of Sophie and Tom at the cliffs. I also told him about Rick Pierce and Sarah Whitmore. Brian listened quietly, his expression growing more serious with every detail. "This isn't just a personal matter anymore," he said, closing the folder of evidence. "We're looking at something much bigger, a full-blown insurance fraud ring." I leaned forward. "What do we do now? Go to the police?" Brian shook his head. "Not yet. I have some contacts who can dig into this quietly. If this Pierce guy is who we think he is, there's no telling how far this scheme goes. We don't want to tip them off too soon." A few tense days passed. I tried to act normal around Sophie, but it was harder with every passing moment. She was calm, collected, even affectionate at times. The way she could look me in the eye, knowing what she was planning, made my skin crawl. Then Brian called. His voice was steady, but I could hear the urgency behind it. "David, listen carefully," he said. I've been in touch with a friend at the Justice Department. The FBI is already investigating Pierce. They've been watching him for months. What you've brought me, photos, notes, recordings, that's exactly the kind of evidence they need to nail him. I felt a surge of hope. So, they're on this? Yes, but it's delicate, Brian warned. This isn't a small operation. Pierce has ties to other fraud cases across the country. They suspect he recruits people in desperate situations, like Sophie and Tom, to stage accidental deaths and split the insurance payouts. I clenched my jaw. And Sophie's just another pawn? Brian paused. Maybe. Or maybe she's more involved than you think. The weight of his words sank in. Sophie wasn't just making a desperate move, she was deep in this. What's next? I asked. The FBI will want to meet with you, Brian said. But for now, you need to stay calm. Act like you don't know anything. We'll coordinate with them to make sure you're protected. After we hung up, I sat there for a long time, staring at the phone. The FBI was already watching. This was bigger than I ever imagined. And now, I was right in the middle of it. Sophie and Tom thought they were in control. But the net was closing in around them, and they had no idea what was coming. 2 days later, I was sitting in a quiet conference room at Brian's law firm. Across the table from me were 2 agents from the FBI. Agent Carter, a woman in her late 40s with sharp eyes, did most of the talking. Her partner, Agent Miller, a younger man with a no-nonsense demeanor, took notes. We've been tracking Rick Pierce for over a year, Carter began, flipping through a thick folder. He's the key figure in an insurance fraud operation that spans multiple states. Your evidence is the first direct link we've had to his newest recruits, your wife and brother. I nodded, feeling a mix of anger and betrayal. So, this is bigger than just Sophie and Tom. Carter's expression hardened. Much bigger. Pierce targets people with financial troubles or strained relationships. He convinces them to stage accidental deaths for the insurance payout. In most cases, the victim is someone they know, someone who trusts them. Miller slid a photo across the table. It showed a man in his 50s, well-dressed and smiling. This is Daniel Whitmore. Sarah's husband. Disappeared 3 years ago. His death was ruled an accident at sea. I clenched my fists. And Sarah cashed in on his policy? Exactly, Carter said. Now Pierce is grooming Sophie and Tom to do the same. The fact that they've forged additional policies in your name confirms that they're ready to move soon. So, what happens now? I asked. We need you to stay calm and keep playing along, Carter said. Pierce is cautious. If he suspects anything, he'll disappear, and we'll lose our chance to bring him down. I shook my head. You want me to act normal while my wife and brother plan my death? It's the only way, Miller said firmly. We'll have agents monitoring you at all times. We'll also plant a tracker on your boat. The moment they try to make a move, we'll be ready. And Sophie? Tom? Carter leaned forward. Once we have enough evidence, they'll both be arrested. But we need to catch them in the act, there's no other way to prove intent. I leaned back in my chair, my mind racing. Can you do it? Carter asked. I took a deep breath. Yeah. But if they try anything? I'm not going down without a fight. As I left the meeting, one thing was clear, I had a role to play. And if Sophie and Tom thought I was an easy target, they were about to be proven very wrong. The FBI's plan was simple, let Sophie and Tom believe everything was going according to schedule, and catch them in the act when they tried to make their move. I went back home, pretending nothing had changed. Sophie greeted me with her usual smile, but now I saw her for who she really was, a woman ready to sacrifice her husband for money. The following week, I told her I was heading out to sea on a solo trip to test the boat's new upgrades. Her eyes lit up for a second before she quickly masked her excitement. "Be careful out there," she said sweetly. "Always am," I replied. Tom came by that evening, and I eavesdropped from the hallway. "Everything's ready," Sophie whispered. "He'll be gone for at least a week. No one will suspect anything." Tom nodded. "I'll handle the boat." That was it, the confirmation I needed. They were going to sabotage my boat, ensuring I never came back. The FBI wired me up before I left for the marina. Agents Carter and Miller gave me one last briefing. "We'll be close," Carter said. "If they make a move, we'll move in." As I prepped the boat, I spotted Tom lurking around the dock. He thought he was being sneaky, but I knew exactly what he was doing: cutting lines, loosening bolts, making sure the boat would fail at sea. I boarded the boat and set off, knowing I wasn't alone. Hidden in the cliffs, a team of FBI agents was watching. About an hour into my trip, I got a text from Carter: "They're on their way to meet Pierce." It was happening. Sophie and Tom thought they'd won. But the trap was closing. Back on shore, Sophie and Tom met with Rick Pierce in a quiet parking lot near the cliffs. The FBI had tapped their phones, and I listened in as the agents followed them. "We did it," Sophie said. "By the time anyone realizes he's missing, we'll be long gone." Rick Pierce handed her a thick envelope. "Here's the first payment. The rest will come after the insurance clears." Suddenly, tires screeched as unmarked FBI cars surrounded them. "FBI. Hands where we can see them." Sophie froze, her face pale as agents swarmed the scene. Tom tried to run but didn't get far. "You set us up," he screamed as they cuffed him. Sophie didn't say a word. She just stared at the ground, defeated. Back at the marina, I returned to shore, relieved but exhausted. Carter met me at the dock. "It's over," she said. "They're in custody." I nodded, my mind still reeling. What happens to Sophie and Tom? "They'll face charges for conspiracy to commit murder, insurance fraud, and more," Carter said. "They're looking at a long time behind bars." As I walked back to my car, I spotted Mr. Hargrove standing by his fence, watching with a knowing look. "Told you to be careful," he said with a smirk. "Thanks for the warning," I replied. I drove home, the house feeling emptier than ever. Charlie was staying with my parents, safe from the chaos. Sophie and Tom had tried to take everything from me. But I was still standing. And they were the ones who lost everything in the end.